In this lecture, we're going to be looking at feminism, and in particular sociological feminism, because there is other forms of feminism, economic, political, etc. We're going to look at the general principles and the history behind the feminist movement, and then look at the specifics of liberal, radical, and Marxist and intersectional feminism. We'll then kind of evaluate them, see how effective they've been. And we are looking at their views on society in general, and you'll then apply this to the topic areas as we continue through the course. So let's start with a definition of feminism. When we're talking about feminism in general, we're talking about the advocacy of women's rights on the ground of the equality of sexes. Now, that doesn't mean that feminists believe that women should be better than men. Women should be raised above men in society. What they're looking for is equality, and that goes both ways. So although they are advocating for women's rights, a lot of feminist groups will also advocate for equality of men's rights. Things like paternity leave and carers' rights. For example, in the 1950s, 1960s, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the famous Supreme Court judge, made a name for herself by taking to the Supreme Court a case of a gentleman who was denied taxation relief for caring for his sick mother because of the assumption by the American government that women were the carers. So therefore, as a man, he was not entitled to that credit. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg took this case to the Supreme Court and had it changed so that both men and women could receive this tax benefit. But when we're looking at sociological feminism, what sociological feminism is looking at is how society is patriarchal, how society benefits men over women, exploits women, and causes the oppression of women. And they suggest that the exploitation that women feel or experience is due to the vulnerability caused by pregnancy and childbirth. There are certain times in the pregnancy, usually just before and just after birth, where women are physically vulnerable. It takes time to recover from childbirth. It's one of the most dangerous things a woman could do to her body. But they argue that society has built itself up around this idea that women are weak and vulnerable. And this is also caused by the fact that men are physically stronger and bigger than women biologically. Obviously, there are exceptions to this rule, but generally men are bigger and stronger than women. So what sociologists and sociological feminists are interested in is finding out about the experiences of women within a patriarchal society and trying to bring around change, going back to that original definition of feminism, the advocacy of equality. So let's look a little bit at the history of feminism, because it is a long history and it's much longer than a lot of people believe. Often people think about the rise of feminism in the 1960s, and that's when feminism came to the front. However, the history of feminism goes back much further than that. We can kind of talk about early feminism being in the late 1700s. And this wonderful woman, Mary Wollstonecraft, who, by the way, was the mother of Mary Shelley, wrote a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. And the story that is given about this book and her passion for equal inheritance rights for women was the fact that she didn't approve of the marriage of Percy Shelley and her daughter Mary. Percy Shelley was a poet, he was a drunk, he was a bit of a philanderer, and she felt that her wealth and her husband's wealth because of the rules of inheritance, would go directly to Percy Shelley and not to her daughter. So Mary Wollstonecraft started kind of campaigning, the first kind of feminist campaign of going, hang on a minute, why can't women own property? Why can't women run businesses and inherit wealth and be financially independent? The argument at the time was women don't have the intellectual capacity for these sort of things. But Mary Wollstonecraft was kind of like, no, women are doing these things all the time, just they're not allowed to do it in their own name. So she wrote this book, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, and started the process of the feminist movement of women discussing politics and discussing society and their rights within society. Now, officially, these were sewing groups, and they were ladies who have tea, but they were discussion groups. They were intellectually rigorous discussions that women were having. Now, after this, there was a long gap before what we consider to be the first wave of feminism. And this was in the 1900s with Emmeline Pankhurst and suffragettes and suffragists and votes for women. And here we start seeing the development of different feminist groups, mostly the liberal feminists and the radical feminists. And the liberal feminist, what we would now consider to be the liberal feminists, would be the suffragists. And they were the ones who were working within government. They were the ones who were trying to change the laws and work within the system to encourage political equal rights for women. The radical feminists were the suffragettes, and the ones that we hear most about. They're the ones who were chaining themselves to fences, hunger strikes in prison, running out underneath the king's horse and carriages and things like that. They had the same goal. Both groups had the same goal. They wanted political rights for women. Now, we hear more about the radical feminists and the suffragettes because they were making a lot of noise. They encouraged media responses to their campaigns. However, it's difficult to say which group really had the most influence on gaining the right to vote for women. Was it the suffragists who were working within the system, or was it the suffragettes who were making a lot of noise? And we're never going to know the answer to that. That's not something that we could actually answer. But it could be argued that this was the formation of those two groups of feminists. And of course, they were successful in their campaigns to get the rights to vote for women. The next wave of feminism, or the second wave of feminism, was the 1960s. Now, I've kind of given Gloria Steinem this wave. She was one of many, many, many feminist writers, campaigners, vocal women during this time. It's just that I needed somebody. And the wave is the goal of the second wave of feminism was to bring women's issues into the public sphere, and to the quote that's used is to make the personal political. And what they meant by that, or make the private political, and what they meant by that was to discuss women's issues that were happening in the home: domestic violence, marital rape, abortion, contraception, all of these things, or bodily autonomy of women, and start a discussion about them and trying to give women the rights to have autonomy over themselves. And some of this they were successful with. In the 1960s we saw the legalization of abortion. I know that's still controversial to today, though, with some of the changes that have happened in laws. It was the legalization of contraception for women. It was the starting of the process to get people talking about domestic violence and to get the police to actually do something about it. The marital rape side of things, unfortunately, that took until the 1990s before that was made illegal in the UK. It was 1997. And it wasn't until the 1970s that women were allowed to have a bank account or a credit card in their own name. Up until that point, the account was actually held in either their father or their husband's name. So the second wave of feminism, we've got that radical feminism with the bra burning and all of that sort of thing, but we also still had the liberal feminists who were working within the system. At the same time, you've got the development of Black feminism and the discussion of the experiences of Black women being different to those of white women. So we're starting to see more development of different types of feminism coming through here. The third wave of feminism, and this is the wave that we're kind of seeing now, and whether again, I've chosen Emma Watson here as my image, but again, there are lots and lots of women who could be the face of the third wave of feminism. And this wave of feminism was focusing on issues of identity and stereotypes, particularly in things like portrayal of women in the media, in terms of gender pay gaps. We saw the rise of the he for she campaigns and the Me Too campaigns, the use of social media to raise women's issues. And this is still ongoing, and there are still issues that are being developed, but now women and men are talking about their experiences of sexual assault and sexual harassment and calling people out for this sort of behaviour. We're not there yet. This is still a long way to go on this, and we're still seeing the development of new types of feminism and the discussion of experiences of different groups of women within society. So this is where we're kind of at the moment with feminism. Some of the goals we could argue have been achieved. I mean, we have the equal political rights for women, but we still don't have an equal parliament. You've got the 50-50 campaign, which is trying to encourage more women to stand for election. We've had we've had female prime ministers. We've had 3 in the last 50-60 years, all Conservative, but we haven't got that representation within Parliament. The majority of Parliament is still male. We do have bodily autonomy and rights for bodily autonomy in terms of reproductive rights. However, there is still a lot of controversy regarding these rights and whether or not these rights are being eroded under the current political situation. So there's still a ways to go. So feminism, I wouldn't say is done. There are more issues that need to be discussed. But the key thing to remember is by advocating for equality for women, feminists are also arguing for equality for men. So what are the 4 basic tenets of feminism? The 4 basic tenets of feminism is the acceptance and acknowledgement of inequality between men and women, with power, status, pay, expectations, gender roles. There is a difference between men and women. They also argue that this difference leads to conflict between men and women. And we see this with this idea or the portrayal of feminism as being bra burning lesbians who hate men. That's not the case. But this conflict shows how gender inequalities are socially constructed. The gender roles that men and women are placed under, the way that they are taught to be masculine or feminine or what the expectations of them are different from society to society. So therefore, it is not biologically determined. Now, we'll come back to that later on in the course, but feminists argue that this biological determinism that shapes the gender role socialization of men and women is a complete social fabrication. And the fourth tenet is the fact that the importance of the concept of patriarchy, a system of social structures and practices in which men dominate, oppress, and exploit women for their own benefit. So all forms of feminism, regardless of whether they're radical feminist, liberal feminist, Marxist feminist, intersectional, black feminist, dual systems feminists, all the different types of feminists agree to these four basic tenets. That there is inequality which leads to conflict, that gender inequality is socially constructed, and patriarchy is the cause of this inequality. So what does that mean, that society is patriarchal? So we're going to talk here about the work of Sylvia Warby. And Sylvia Warby identified 6 structures of patriarchy, so 6 ways that society dominates, oppresses, and exploits women. The first one is an obvious one: paid work. There is a pay gap, and the International Day of the Woman is kind of accumulation of understanding this pay gap. So at present, for the same job, for the same role, on average, women are earning 80 pence for every pound a man earns. I think that's about right, the current system. It might be slightly less than that. The development, the way that this kind of came to the forefront was due to a strike in Iceland. And feminists in Iceland worked out where a point in the year where women basically started working for free if pay was equal. So on that day, they went on strike. They didn't do any housework. They didn't do any work. They walked out of their jobs. They basically went and sat in a park and had a picnic, among other things. And the country pretty much ground to a halt. So highlighting the amount of work that women were doing unpaid. And in Iceland, they do this strike every year at this, to highlight this. However, it's getting later and later into the year. Iceland is on track for complete pay equality by the end of 2035, I think. Other countries around the world are far, 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 far away from that. But by paying women less, it is giving men power. Financial power over partners, financial power over the household, because they earn more. And with more financial pay, more financial power, they have more control. The second one is household work. And again, this is no surprise. It is worked out that on average, women do far more housework than men. Again, unpaid domestic labour. So we're not talking about people who are cleaners by profession. We are talking about looking after your own home and doing chores within your own home. Now, you'd think during COVID, when everybody was locked up, under lockdown and staying at home, this would have equaled out. However, studies have shown that this is not the case. And in fact, it got worse. Women were expected to do remote work if they were working, look after any children, including homeschooling, and still do the majority of the housework. So again, this is oppressing and exploiting women through unpaid work, and leads to women not seeing the household as a as the home as a place of refuge, but a second place of work. The third one is culture. And the idea here is that the culture of, or the way that women are portrayed in culture, and particularly the media, is often in a way that reinforces gender stereotypes of women being sexualized beings, of being not worthy of anything but their the way that they look. Their value is determined by their beauty, if you like, whereas men are portrayed in a more suave, sophisticated system. This links into the next one, which is sexuality, and we're not talking here about who you're attracted to, but how women and men are portrayed in terms of their own sexual activity. Women are often perceived as needing to be virtuous, needing to be innocent and pure, and anyone who, or any woman who is sexually active, it's a bad thing. They're called nasty names: hussy, slut, wench, floozy, skank. When they're victims of sexual assault, they were asking for it. What did they do wrong? Whereas men are often referred to in a completely opposite way with regard to their sexuality and their sexual prowess. They're manly, they're a ladies' man, they're cool, they're a stud, they're macho. And we even see this on children's clothing. Things like baby clothes that say future ladies' man, or lock up your daughters, wait until I get older, kind of thing. The next one is about violence, and in particular the fact that men are able to use their physicality and the fact that they are biologically larger than women to dominate, exploit, and abuse women. Now, although we are seeing more and more people, men, reporting to be victims of abuse, the majority of victims are still female. And I believe that it's something like 4 or 5 women each week are killed by a partner or an ex-partner. The final way is through the state, and I've touched on this a little bit earlier, but there isn't a equality in the number of women within Parliament, or the number of women who are standing for election. And Sylvia Warby argues that the government is run by men, so the policies and the interests of the government tend to benefit men. And this is not just in the UK, this is in a majority of Western countries. And a good example of this is in America with the reversal of Roe versus Wade, where you have government of white middle-class Christian men determining what women can do with their bodies. They're sort of like, they're pro-life, they're pro not they call it the murder of babies, whether or not that's controversial in and of itself. But these men are then not thinking about what happens after that baby is born. And it can be argued that this is, again, being used to further men's interests, because it's then kind of like, well, you've had a baby, you've got to stay home and look after it. You're the one that's got to take time out of your career, time out of your working life to look after the said child. It's the man's role to bring in the money. So Sylvia Warby argues that the way that Western governments are male dominated means that policies that may look like they are about equality are in fact pushing a male agenda. Another example here would be maternity leave. And now, on the face of it, the maternity leave law seems like it's a good thing for women. It's saying you can have X amount of time off work paid to have and raise your child. However, some feminists would argue that this is promoting gender roles, certain gender roles, because it's the mother who gets that leave, not the father. Or there is now choice after a certain amount of time, and yes, women do need a certain amount of time off to recover from childbirth, but it is again reinforcing that view that the woman should be the primary caregiver to the children. So let's now start looking at the specific types of feminism. Now, obviously, we're not going to go into all of them because we'd be here forever. We're going to look specifically at liberal, radical, Marxist, and intersectional feminism. What they believe, what some of their ideas are, and then evaluating their strengths and limitations. So the first one, looking at liberal feminism. This comes from the idea that liberalist idea that all humans should have equality, rights, and freedoms. So the liberal feminism believes that as women are human, which is obvious, they should have the same rights and freedoms as men. So this is not necessarily saying that women should be above men or that women need more than men. They are actually saying that we need to consider some of these policies and rights and responsibilities, rights and freedoms that men should have as well as women, such as shared parental leave. And their main way that they believe that this should be occurring is through reform. So through things such as policies from government, laws from government, but also education and educating people on their rights and responsibilities. So let's look at how this has been done. So the thing to remember with feminist thinkers is they don't necessarily always stay within the same group of feminism. They may move around a little bit depending on what they're actually talking about. So Anne Oakley is someone we will come across a lot more throughout this course. She did a study on housework in 1974 that found that women were felt about housework the same way that a factory line worker felt about their work. It was boring, it was repetitive, and it was never ending. We've also got Sue Sharp, and again we'll come across this study a lot more throughout this unit. And she did a study, How Girls Learn to Be Women, in 1994. And this looked at how gender role socialization has changed over time. So liberal feminists believe that there needs to be changes in certain areas in order to aid the path to equalities. But these changes should be achieved through education and reform. They shouldn't be radical, overthrowing, revolution. If we want to have meaningful, long-lasting change, it needs to be slow and gradual. And the reason for this is because you need people to embed the change into their identities. You need them to kind of accept the change and move forward, rather than sudden change where people are kind of like, well, I don't want to do that. I'm not doing that. No. They need to. It's almost like convincing somebody that the change or the reform is their own idea. So how has this worked? So the liberal feminists have been working in a number of areas to develop more equal practices. For example, in the workplace, they are challenging the institutional sexism and challenging the glass ceiling. They are pushing for equality in the workplace, calling out sexual harassment, calling out the pay gap, ensuring that women are not passed over for promotion just because they might have a child. In the laws, we've got things like the Equal Pay Act anti-discrimination laws, better care for victims of sexual crimes, among many, many others, which are out to not only promote equality, but also protect women under the law. Social policy, more work, as I've said, there is changes in shared parental leave, and there is more work to be done on this, and the creation of nursery vouchers so that both parents can go back to work should they wish to. In education, expectations have changed, but more work needs to be done. We've got the rise of women in science and engineering, WISE and GIST. We've got changes to the curriculum to make it more gender equal, including more feminist female writers in English, talking about female scientists in science, looking at women's experiences through history and things like that. And in the family, we see more women are pursuing their careers. There is a more equal split in household tasks and childcare, but the majority of childcare is still around women. For example, I often see examples of this on social media where schools, despite being told to call the father, will automatically call the mother when there is a problem or an issue with their child at school, even if they've been told, don't call mum, call dad. Things are changing, but generally there is still that expectation that if there is an issue, speak to mum. So let's evaluate this liberal feminism. What is good about this is we do see that we can overcome gender inequality and discrimination without violence. That we can do it where women are not being given the feminazi kind of label that they are bra-burning, man-hating feminists. It also shows how gender differences are socially constructed, because there have been changes and there has been development in roles and responsibilities of men and women, and they have had an important influence on social policy. We've seen that. We've seen the laws and the policies that have changed due to the campaigning of the liberal feminists. But radical feminists would argue that the liberals ignore the need for revolutionary action. If we want change to happen, radical feminists say it has to be revolutionary. It has to be short, sharp shock. They're also criticised for being overly optimistic, pointing out that there has not been as much change as they would like to say there has been, due to the superficial nature of the policies and laws that have been put in place. And the biggest criticism of liberal feminism is all the policies and changes and laws that have been brought in have dealt with the symptom of the oppression, not the causes. It is not dealing with the patriarchy that is causing this inequality. So now we're going to go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum and look at the radical feminists. And these feminists, as I said, you could say these are the OG two groups, the liberals and the radicals. But the radicals believe that patriarchy is universal, and it comes from the fact that women have children, and by having children, it makes them vulnerable. Now, this is biologically true, that the last few weeks before giving birth and the first few weeks after giving birth, a woman is physically vulnerable. It is a huge toll on the body to carry and bear children, and women do need to be looked after in these periods of time. But the radical feminists say that that men are the enemy, because all men, whether they're straight, they're gay, they're trans, whatever, they are benefiting from patriarchy. As I said, these guys are the polar opposite to the liberal feminists. These guys believe men are the enemy, and they don't believe that the lobbying for legal changes is going to bring equality. There has to be a radical shift. So a key thinker here is Germaine Greer, who has been a prolific writer about radical feminism. And they advocate for three ways to bring around and achieve equality. The first is separatism, which means that men and women live separately. There is no way to achieve equality with men and women living together. They also believe in collective action, meaning the revolutionary action that needs women to come together and rise up to overthrow patriarchy. And the last one they talk about is is political lesbianism. And what this means is taking away men's sexual power. Again, it's that physicality that men have, that they are able to dominate women sexually. And so this doesn't mean that turning all women into lesbians, it's about taking away men's sexual power over women. And all of this will create a new culture of female independence, free from patriarchy. So by doing these things, by taking away that sexual power, by coming together as a collective group and separating men from women, women will have independence free from patriarchy. Greer also argues that there should be a creation of matrilocal households rather than a heterosexual family. And what she meant by this was that rather than having privatized family units, instead you had shared child rearing in these matrilocal households. Going back to that idea of it takes a village to raise a child. And this would create equality because no one would have power over anybody else. So what are the strengths of radical feminism? On the surface, it's kind of like, that's ridiculous, this is never going to work. But it does have its strengths, because it does raise the profile of what has previously been considered private issues. It is raising that idea of sexual dominance and sexual inequality that men use to oppress and exploit women. It's bringing out this domestic violence and domestic abuse and making people talk about it. And again, it is exposing the social construction of gender and gender roles. These roles that society tells us you must have in order to be normal. I'm not sure I like that word, but normal. They've shown that isn't actually the case. And you can have societies where these gender roles do not exist. But radical feminists do use violence to achieve their aims, making giving all feminists a bad name, because it's the system of violence and violent action that makes people believe that feminism is the feminazis, the man-hating, bra-burning group. It also ignores the elements of choice within a relationship, and the fact that in modern society there is a lot more choice regarding who does what, where, when, why, and how. You have stay-at-home dads, you have equal division of labour within the household, you have female breadwinners, and the postmodernists would argue that there has been more choice within the family unit now. It is about creating a family unit and a relationship that works for you. Jenny Somerville, who is another feminist, does argue that the radical feminists ignore all the progress that's been made. Because it's not been revolutionary and fast-paced, it's been gradual and slow, they dismiss the progress that has been made. Next up, we've got the Marxist feminists. And it won't surprise you here to hear that they believe that capitalism is patriarchal and the cause of women's oppression. So they're kind of looking at both Marxism, capitalism and patriarchy as being the causes of female oppression, and that capitalism in and of itself is patriarchal. They argue that women create and socialize the next generation of workers. By having children, the way that children are brought up by women gets them ready for the next generation to go into the world of work. They also argue that women act as a reserve labour force. Now, this was particularly prominent during World War I and World War II, where women stepped up and filled roles within industry and within farming and things like that while men were away at war. And obviously, when men came back, women were sent back to the kitchen. However, even in modern society, women are still seen as a reserve labour force. A majority of part-time workers are female. They're the gap fillers, if you like, within industry, because women are considered to be more likely to be, or more likely to ask to be part-time than men are. And finally, women absorb men's frustrations at their own oppression through what Zaretsky refers to as the cushioning effect. And this leads to men being able to go out and work, because when they get home, the man is the king of the castle, the home is the man's castle, and all of that, which women take out, receive the frustrations through domestic violence or through a lack of power within the relationship, which allows men to go out and continue working within a capitalist system. Our key thinker here is Michelle Bartlett, and she argues that in a capitalist system, women are forced to rely on men, particularly during late stages of pregnancy and after giving birth, as we have said before. They also argue that the nuclear family is patriarchal, and gender role socialization still states that women can only obtain fulfillment and only obtain their ultimate goal in life if they have children and if they have a family. Otherwise, they're missing out on something. So, and you still see it today. Women are told that if they don't have children, oh, you're going to regret it, or who's going to look after you in your old age, and all of these sort of things. It is getting better, but there is still this societal idea that it's okay to ask women why they've not chosen to not have children, and that to judge women based upon their ability or their choices regarding childbirth. And Michelle Bartlett said that once we overthrow capitalism, the ideology of familialism will disappear, and this will allow for more equality. So in order to achieve equality, we need to overthrow capitalism, which will get rid of the need for the patriarchal nuclear family, which will then lead to more greater equality for women. Now, again, there are strengths and limitations to this system of feminism. It does show the importance of economic production in all areas of social life, and how economic determinism could also lead to female oppression. And it shows greater understanding of the structural causes of women's oppression, that this oppression is coming from a social and economic system rather than individuals. However, even when we look at non-capitalist societies, socialist societies such as the USSR, Cuba, China, women are still oppressed, showing that the removal of capitalism from a society does not equal equality for women. It doesn't explain why women perform unpaid domestic labour and not men. Why do women do this? Why is it the expectation of women to do this domestic labour and not men? There is nothing physically wrong with men, meaning that they cannot do this domestic labour, and nowadays many do. And there is a lack of emphasis on how man, not capitalism, oppress women. Women can be just as greedy, competitive, and materialistic as men can be. So why is it that men are able to oppress women if women can buy into the capitalist system just as much as men can? Our last form of feminism we're going to look at is intersectional feminism, and this is a system of feminism that doesn't see women as a single homogenous group who share the same issues and the same problems. They argue that other forms of feminism have created a false universality about women's experiences within society, and it's based around white Western middle class women, suggesting that their experiences of patriarchy are what all women experience in patriarchy, and that's not the case. And whether women are working depending on their class, depending on their ethnicity, their race, their religion, these can all feed into different experiences of patriarchy. So there isn't a one size fits all type, fits all solution to patriarchy. Judith Butler is our key thinker here, and again, remember these sociologists will jump around a little bit in terms of which type of feminism they are they kind of fit into at any particular time. But Judith Butler argues that white middle-class Western women are dominating the feminist movement, creating this false universality because they have the time and the money to do so. They are the ones who have the status and the access to raise their concerns, and this creates this false universality. And Judith Butler argues that there needs to be more discourses. There needs to be more ways of seeing, thinking, or speaking about something. Feminist or patriarchal experiences are not universal. So therefore, there needs to be lots of discourses surrounding experiences of patriarchy. And this links into our identities and whether or not we're seeing this discourse through our own identities or through others' identities is really important to determine how we are going to reach equality. And this allows us to analyze and look at different forms of oppression. For example, a black or ethnic minority woman may find that their home is not a patriarchal form of oppression due to the oppression they are facing in wider society through racism. So instead of seeing their home as an oppressive place to be, they see it as a place of refuge away from a different form of oppression. So strengths and limitations again. This allows the intersectional view allows us to see that oppression is individualized, it is different for different people, and it allows for different forms of resistance to achieve equality. So it's not saying that there is one road to equality. There are many roads to equality, and different people will need to follow different paths to it. However, with so many subgroups saying, well, this is our form of oppression, or this is our form of oppression, and this is our form of patriarchy, it weakens the feminist movement because it's looking at the nuances rather than the big picture. And Siegel suggests that it abandons any notion of objective social structures by seeing oppression and patriarchy in so many different ways. It's not taking an objective macro view of society. So that was kind of a whistle-stop tour of feminism and different forms of feminism that you're going to come across as we go through this course and through your study of sociology.